The people who look least important are often the ones holding the room together. Daniel Carter heard that sentence years ago, but he rarely thought about it anymore. Most days, life was too busy for philosophy. On a cool Tuesday morning, he was focused on getting his 8-year-old daughter to school on time. The old pickup truck rattled softly as they drove through downtown Chicago. Emma sat beside him holding a science workbook on her lap. "Do you think volcanoes are cooler than rockets?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether you like things that explode or things that fly." Emma considered that carefully. "I like both." "That sounds expensive." She laughed. The truck turned into a parking garage beneath a large financial building. Emma looked up at the towering structure through the windshield. "Why are we stopping here?" "I have to take care of something at the bank." "Important?" Daniel parked the truck. "A little." Emma nodded seriously, as if she had just received confidential information. Together they entered the marble lobby. People in business suits moved quickly through the building carrying briefcases, laptops, and coffee cups. Nobody paid attention to Daniel. His jeans were slightly faded. His work jacket looked well used. His watch was simple. He looked like an ordinary father running errands before lunch. The bank occupied the first floor. Inside, everything felt polished and quiet. Bright lighting reflected off marble floors. Private offices lined one side of the room while customers waited near teller stations. Daniel took a number and sat beside Emma. She immediately opened her workbook. "You know," she said quietly, "everyone here looks busy." Daniel glanced around. "That is usually how banks work." "Do you think they are actually busy?" "Some of them probably are." Emma nodded. A few minutes later their number appeared on a screen. Daniel approached a service desk while Emma followed beside him. A young employee greeted them politely. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Daniel handed over several documents. "I need assistance with a transfer." The employee began entering information into her computer. Everything seemed routine. Then something changed. Her eyes moved across the screen. She stopped typing. Looked down at the paperwork. Then back at the monitor. For a moment she thought she had entered something incorrectly. She checked again. Her expression shifted slightly. Not alarm. Confusion. Daniel noticed but said nothing. The employee adjusted her posture and restarted part of the process. Once again, the same result appeared. She stared at the screen a little longer this time. Emma looked up from her workbook. "Did the computer break?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Probably not." The employee forced a professional smile. "One moment, please." She stood and walked toward another workstation. Daniel remained calm. Emma returned to her homework. Across the room, the employee quietly showed her screen to a coworker. That coworker leaned closer. Then closer still. Both exchanged puzzled looks. A few seconds later another employee joined them. Daniel sat quietly waiting while the small group stared at the monitor. Whatever they were seeing had captured their full attention. And although nobody in the lobby knew it yet, a single number on that screen was about to turn an ordinary morning into something none of them would forget. The group near the workstation grew from 2 employees to 4. None of them seemed willing to walk back to Daniel with an explanation. Instead, they continued studying the monitor as if it had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Daniel remained seated beside Emma. He looked completely unconcerned. Emma, meanwhile, had reached the section of her workbook involving volcanoes. "Did you know some volcanoes sleep for hundreds of years?" she asked. "I did." "How?" "I read a book once." She narrowed her eyes. "You always say that." "Because it is usually true." Emma accepted the answer and returned to her work. Across the room, one of the employees finally approached. Her smile appeared slightly forced. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel looked up. "Yes? Would you mind coming with me for a moment?" Daniel stood. Emma grabbed her workbook and followed. The employee led them toward a private office near the back of the branch. The change in treatment was subtle but noticeable. 10 minutes earlier he had been just another customer waiting in line. Now people seemed uncertain how they were supposed to interact with him. Inside the office sat a middle-aged employee wearing a name badge identifying him as Assistant Branch Supervisor. He immediately stood to shake Daniel's hand. "Thank you for your patience." Daniel shook his hand politely. "Of course." The supervisor glanced toward the documents. Then toward his computer screen. Then back toward Daniel. "There appears to be a discrepancy." Daniel remained calm. "What kind?" "The transfer amount." Emma looked up. "What is a discrepancy?" Daniel smiled. "A fancy word for a problem." "Oh." She seemed satisfied with that explanation. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Our system is displaying an unusually large figure." Daniel nodded. "That would be correct." The supervisor blinked. "Correct?" "Yes." The man looked back at the monitor. $8 million? Daniel simply nodded. Silence settled over the room. The supervisor studied him carefully. Daniel did not look like someone moving $8 million. His clothes were ordinary. His truck was probably older than some employees working in the branch. There were no signs of wealth. No expensive watch. No designer clothing. No visible attempt to impress anyone. Emma quietly raised her hand. "Can I ask something?" The supervisor smiled awkwardly. "Sure. Is $8 million a lot?" The room became very quiet. Daniel fought back a smile. "For most people, yes." Emma considered that. "Is that why everybody looks nervous?" This time even the supervisor could not hide his reaction. He laughed softly. "Maybe a little." Another employee entered the office carrying printed documents. She handed them over without speaking. The supervisor reviewed them carefully. The longer he read, the more confused he appeared. Every verification check came back clean. Every account identifier matched. Every authorization record was valid. Nothing suggested fraud. Nothing suggested error. Yet something about the situation still felt impossible to him. Finally he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Carter, I think we may need additional approval before processing this request." Daniel nodded. "That is fine. It could take some time. I am not in a hurry." The supervisor stared at him for another moment. Most customers became frustrated during delays. Daniel seemed completely relaxed. Almost as though he already knew how this would end. And somewhere beyond the office walls, word about the unusual transfer had already begun spreading through the branch. By late morning, the unusual transfer had become the most discussed topic inside the branch. Employees who had never met Daniel Carter suddenly knew his name. Not because they understood who he was, but because nobody could explain why a customer who looked completely ordinary was attempting to move such an extraordinary amount of money. Daniel sat quietly in the private office while Emma continued working through her science workbook. The calmness between them seemed almost out of place compared to the growing tension outside the room. Every few minutes another employee walked past the glass wall and glanced inside. Some tried to be discreet. Others did not bother. Emma eventually looked up from her workbook. "Why do they keep staring?" Daniel smiled. "People get curious." "About money?" "Sometimes." Emma thought about that. "Money seems boring." The assistant supervisor laughed softly from across the desk. Most people would disagree. Before Emma could respond, the office door opened. A tall man in an expensive suit stepped inside carrying a tablet. His name badge identified him as Richard Coleman, branch manager. The room immediately felt different. Unlike the other employees, Richard did not appear confused. He appeared annoyed. His eyes moved from Daniel's worn jacket to the paperwork on the desk. Then to the computer screen. Then back to Daniel. "Mr. Carter." Daniel nodded politely. "Good morning." Richard did not return the smile. "I understand there is a situation involving an unusually large transfer request." "That sounds accurate." Richard pulled a chair closer and sat down. $8 million. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Richard folded his arms. "That is a significant amount of money." "It is." The manager studied him for a long moment. "And you are requesting this transfer today?" "Correct." Richard tapped his fingers against the table. "Interesting." The word did not sound complimentary. Emma sensed the shift immediately. She lowered her workbook and quietly watched the conversation. Richard turned his attention toward the documents. "Mr. Carter, these situations occasionally occur when customers misunderstand account balances, pending transactions, or investment statements." Daniel remained calm. "I understand. Sometimes people see figures that do not represent immediately available funds." "That is true." Richard leaned back slightly. "So perhaps we should start by confirming exactly what you believe is in the account." The room became very quiet. The assistant supervisor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even he could hear the implication hidden beneath the question. Daniel simply looked at the manager. "I know exactly what is in the account." Richard smiled thinly. "I am sure you believe that." Emma frowned. She did not fully understand the conversation, but she understood tone. Children often did. Daniel noticed her expression and gave her a reassuring glance. Richard continued. "You have to understand, Mr. Carter, transactions of this size are usually handled through private banking relationships, corporate representatives, family offices, things of that nature." His eyes briefly moved toward Daniel's clothing. "Not typically through a standard walk-in request." Daniel nodded slowly. "And yet here we are." For the first time, the assistant supervisor looked like he might laugh. Richard did not. He opened the tablet and reviewed additional records. Then something unusual happened. His expression changed for just a second. Not enough for most people to notice. But enough for Daniel to see. Whatever information Richard had just accessed was not what he expected. And for the first time since entering the office, the branch manager stopped talking and started reading. Richard stared at the tablet much longer than before. The confidence he had displayed when entering the office did not disappear completely, but it shifted. Something in the records was forcing him to reevaluate the situation. He tapped through several screens, reviewed authorization codes, account structures, and ownership details. Then he reviewed them again. The assistant supervisor quietly watched from across the desk. Daniel sat patiently beside Emma as though none of this concerned him. Finally Richard placed the tablet down. "There appears to be a complication." Daniel nodded. "What kind?" Richard hesitated. "The account verification is returning classifications that are not normally visible at the branch level." The assistant supervisor blinked. "What does that mean?" Richard ignored the question. Instead, he looked directly at Daniel. "How long have you been banking with us?" "A while." "Can you be more specific?" Daniel thought about it. "About 14 years. Richard leaned back. 14 years. The answer only created more questions. Customers with unusual account structures were often wealthy. But they rarely arrived wearing work boots and driving old pickup trucks. Emma looked between the adults. Is 14 years a good answer? Daniel smiled. It was the true answer. She nodded, satisfied. Richard picked up the tablet again. The more he reviewed the information, the less comfortable he seemed. Yet instead of becoming more respectful, he became more defensive. Mr. Carter, I hope you understand that extraordinary transactions require extraordinary scrutiny. I do. Particularly when the circumstances appear unusual. Daniel remained calm. Appear unusual to whom? For a brief moment the room became silent. The assistant supervisor suddenly found the paperwork in front of him very interesting. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. To any reasonable observer. Daniel simply nodded. I see. Emma quietly closed her workbook. She was paying full attention now. Children often notice tension long before adults realized it was visible. Outside the office, several employees had gathered near nearby workstations. They pretended to work while clearly monitoring developments. The transfer had become the unofficial center of attention inside the branch. Richard finally stood. I am going to escalate this for additional review. That is fine. It may take some time. I have time. Richard looked almost frustrated by Daniel's refusal to become upset. Every attempt to create pressure seemed to disappear the moment it reached him. Before leaving, Richard paused near the door. One more question. Daniel looked up. Sure. Why transfer the funds personally? Daniel glanced toward Emma. Then back toward the manager. Because I happen to be in the neighborhood. The answer was so simple that Richard did not know what to do with it. After he left, the assistant supervisor quietly exhaled. That meeting could have gone better. Daniel smiled faintly. For who? The supervisor laughed despite himself. A few minutes later, activity throughout the branch increased dramatically. Calls were being made. Messages were being sent. Additional records were being requested. Somewhere higher in the organization, people were beginning to receive notifications connected to Daniel Carter's account. Emma watched employees moving quickly through the lobby beyond the glass wall. Did something happen? She asked. Daniel looked toward the growing commotion. I think somebody finally asked the right question. Emma tilted her head. What question? Daniel smiled. They are trying to figure out who owns the account. He glanced toward the hallway where Richard had disappeared. The interesting part is what happens when they find out. The next 30 minutes felt strangely calm inside the office, but beyond the glass walls the branch had transformed into something very different. Employees moved quickly between workstations. Managers spoke in lowered voices. Several calls had already been placed to departments far above the authority level of the local branch. Every new response seemed to create even more questions. Daniel sat comfortably while Emma colored a diagram of a volcano beside him. Neither appeared concerned by the growing attention. The assistant supervisor checked his computer again. Then again. Finally he looked at Daniel. Can I ask you something? Daniel nodded. Sure. Did you know this would happen? Emma looked up immediately. She seemed interested in the answer too. Daniel smiled slightly. I expected questions. Not this many. Daniel glanced toward the activity outside the office. Probably not this many. The assistant supervisor shook his head. I have worked here 11 years. He lowered his voice. I have never seen anything like this. Before Daniel could respond, the office phone rang. The supervisor answered. His expression changed almost immediately. Yes. A pause. Understood. Another pause. Right away. He slowly returned the receiver to its cradle. They want Richard upstairs. Who does? Daniel asked. Regional operations. Emma blinked. Is that important? The supervisor laughed nervously. Very. Moments later Richard reappeared. His confidence had not completely disappeared, but something about him seemed less certain now. He carried his tablet tightly under one arm. I need to step away briefly, he said. Additional review is being conducted. Daniel nodded. Take your time. Richard hesitated. He seemed to expect frustration. Or impatience. Instead, he received the same calm response Daniel had given all morning. After the manager left again, Emma leaned toward her father. Everybody keeps saying review. That is true. What does it mean? Daniel considered the question. It means people are trying to understand something. Do they not understand money? The assistant supervisor laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Outside the office, employees continued exchanging curious looks. Some had started searching internal directories. Others were reviewing account notes they rarely needed to access. One detail appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Special handling instructions. Executive authorization requirements. Restricted visibility levels. Yet nowhere did the files clearly explain why. That uncertainty only fueled more speculation. Nearly 40 minutes later Richard returned once again. This time he looked different. Not angry. Not skeptical. Concerned. He sat down without speaking. Then opened his tablet and reviewed a message that had apparently just arrived. The room remained silent. Finally he looked at Daniel. Mr. Carter. Yes? Richard hesitated. Have we met before? Daniel smiled faintly. Not that I remember. Richard stared at him. Interesting. Emma frowned. Why is that interesting? Richard looked at her and seemed unsure how to answer. Because the truth was becoming difficult to ignore. Somewhere far above the branch level, people knew exactly who Daniel Carter was. And judging by the reactions now moving through the organization, those people considered him far more important than anyone in this building had originally assumed. The question was no longer whether the transfer would be approved. The question was why Daniel's name carried so much weight. And for the first time all morning, Richard seemed genuinely worried about the answer. Just after noon, the atmosphere inside the branch changed again. Until that moment, the uncertainty had belonged mostly to the employees. Now it was spreading upward through the organization. Calls were no longer being routed through regional supervisors. They were reaching executive offices. Daniel noticed it immediately, not because anyone told him, but because people had stopped pretending everything was normal. The assistant supervisor's computer chimed several times in rapid succession. Each notification seemed to make him sit a little straighter. Richard spent most of his time moving between offices, hallways, and private phone calls. Every time he returned, he appeared more distracted than before. Emma had finished her workbook and was now drawing a rocket ship on a blank sheet of paper. Do you think rockets are harder than volcanoes? She asked. Daniel smiled. Depends who builds them. You always answer questions with questions. That is because good questions are valuable. Emma accepted that explanation, although she looked unconvinced. The office door opened once again. This time a senior operations manager entered carrying a folder. Unlike everyone else, she did not appear confused. She appeared focused. Her eyes immediately found Daniel. Mr. Carter? Yes. Would you mind confirming your identification once more? Daniel handed over his driver's license. She reviewed it carefully. Then compared it to several documents inside the folder. After a few seconds, she nodded. Thank you. Richard watched the exchange closely. Is there a problem? The operations manager looked at him. No, then why are we verifying again? She paused before answering. Because executive offices requested direct confirmation. Silence settled over the room. Even Emma stopped drawing. Richard stared at her. Executive offices? Yes. From where? The manager hesitated. Corporate headquarters. Richard looked as though somebody had removed the floor beneath him. Branch-level issues rarely attracted attention from headquarters. A transfer request almost never did. Unless the customer involved was someone very unusual. The operations manager closed the folder. Then she turned back toward Daniel. Thank you for your patience today. Daniel nodded. No problem. Someone from headquarters may contact the branch shortly. Richard immediately spoke. Who? The manager gave him a look that suggested she already knew more than she intended to share. I believe you will find out soon enough. After she left, the room remained silent. Emma finally broke it. Everybody keeps saying headquarters. Daniel laughed softly. That is true. Why? Daniel thought about the question. Sometimes people discover something they did not expect. Like finding a dinosaur? A little less exciting than that. Emma smiled. Across the office, Richard stared at his tablet again. His skepticism had disappeared completely. In its place was something far more uncomfortable. Uncertainty. Every new verification had confirmed the same thing. Every system check had returned clean. Every authorization requirement had been satisfied. Yet the deeper the organization looked, the more attention Daniel's account seemed to attract. 20 minutes later, another message appeared on Richard's screen. He opened it immediately. The color drained from his face. He read it once. Then again. Finally he looked up at Daniel. For several seconds he said nothing. The branch manager who had questioned everything earlier now appeared unable to form a complete sentence. Because the message contained a name that nobody expected to see connected to a routine transfer review. And somewhere in another part of the city, a powerful executive had just been informed that Daniel Carter was sitting inside a local branch waiting for a transaction to be completed. At 12:43 in the afternoon, every employee inside the branch noticed the same thing at nearly the same moment. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. Heads turned toward the main entrance. A black executive vehicle had just pulled up outside the building. Then a second one arrived behind it. Nobody knew why. But somehow everyone sensed it was connected to the events unfolding throughout the day. Inside the private office, Daniel was helping Emma draw fins on her rocket ship. It needs more speed, she said. How much more? A lot more. Daniel nodded seriously. That is a highly technical measurement. Emma smiled. Before she could answer, a knock sounded at the office door. Richard entered immediately. His usual confidence had been replaced by something much closer to anxiety. Mr. Carter. Daniel looked up. Yes? Richard hesitated. Someone is here to see you. Emma tilted her head. Who? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment he seemed unsure how to explain what was happening. An executive from headquarters. Daniel nodded as if hearing nothing unusual. I see. Richard stared at him. You expected this? Not exactly. The branch manager looked almost frustrated by the answer. Outside the office, activity had reached a level that no longer resembled normal banking operations. Employees who rarely left their desks were standing near hallways. Supervisors had appeared from departments most customers never saw. Several people were quietly straightening their clothing and adjusting their posture. The atmosphere felt less like a bank and more like an inspection. A few moments later the office door opened again. This time nobody spoke immediately. The woman standing in the doorway carried herself with effortless confidence. She wore a tailored business suit and moved with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. Several employees behind her looked noticeably nervous. Richard stepped aside almost instantly. The assistant supervisor stood. Even the operations staff outside the office seemed to freeze. Emma looked up at the woman curiously. "Are you the executive?" A faint smile appeared on the woman's face. "I am." Emma nodded. "Everybody seems very excited." The woman laughed softly. "I noticed." Daniel slowly stood from his chair. For the first time all day, the room felt completely still. The executive's eyes met his. There was no confusion in her expression. No skepticism. No uncertainty. Unlike everyone else in the building, she appeared to know exactly who he was. Richard looked from one to the other. Then back again. Something about their interaction immediately confirmed his growing suspicion. This was not a routine customer relationship. Not even close. The executive took a step forward. Employees outside the office watched silently. Several held their breath without realizing it. Somewhere during the previous hour, the story had changed. What began as an unusual transfer request had evolved into something much larger. Daniel remained calm. The executive smiled politely. "It has been quite some time." Daniel returned the smile. "It has." Richard felt his stomach drop slightly. Because that simple exchange revealed more than all the account records and authorization codes combined. These two people already knew each other. And judging by the respect visible in her expression, the branch manager suddenly realized that everyone in the building might have misunderstood who Daniel Carter really was from the very beginning. For several long seconds, nobody inside the office moved. The silence felt almost physical. Employees standing outside the glass walls watched carefully, sensing they were about to witness something important. Richard stood near the door, trying to understand how a routine transfer request had somehow led to an executive appearance from headquarters. The woman stepped fully into the room. Her presence alone seemed to change the atmosphere. Confidence without arrogance. Authority without effort. Emma studied her with the direct curiosity only children possess. "Do you work at the bank?" The executive smiled warmly. "Something like that." Emma nodded. "You must be important." Several employees outside the office exchanged nervous glances. The woman laughed softly. "That depends who you ask." Then she turned toward Daniel. The warmth remained, but now it was joined by unmistakable respect. "I apologize for the delay today." Daniel shrugged slightly. "I have had worse afternoons." The response drew a few nervous smiles from nearby staff. Richard did not smile. He was too focused on what was happening in front of him. The executive extended her hand. Daniel shook it. The gesture looked ordinary. Yet everyone watching could tell it was not. This was not the greeting of a customer and a corporate representative. It felt more like the greeting of equals. Richard felt his pulse quicken. The executive finally looked around the room. "Has the transfer been processed?" Nobody answered immediately. The question itself seemed to expose the problem. Eventually Richard cleared his throat. Additional reviews were being conducted. Her eyes moved toward him. Were they? The manager suddenly found himself choosing his words much more carefully than before. Given the size of the transaction, I believed further verification was appropriate. And what did the verification reveal? Richard hesitated. Everything appears legitimate. Appears? The single word landed softly, yet somehow carried more weight than a raised voice ever could. Richard swallowed. Everything is legitimate. The executive nodded. That is what I expected. Emma looked between them. Everybody seems nervous today. The executive smiled. Sometimes adults make simple things complicated. Emma seemed to agree with that assessment. Outside the office, several employees quietly pretended to be busy while listening to every word. The executive turned back toward Daniel. I was informed as soon as your name appeared in the review chain. Daniel nodded. That explains the motorcade outside. She laughed. Unfortunately. Richard blinked. The statement answered several questions and created dozens more. The executive's expression softened slightly. You should not have experienced delays. Daniel remained calm. It is not a problem. Nevertheless, it should not have happened. Then she glanced toward the manager again. The room grew still. Richard suddenly understood something important. This conversation was not about money. It was not even about the transfer anymore. It was about recognition. Everyone in the branch had spent hours trying to determine whether Daniel Carter was who he claimed to be. Meanwhile, the executive seemed confused that anyone would question it. Finally, she stepped closer to Daniel. Employees outside leaned forward slightly. Richard held his breath without realizing it. The executive offered a respectful smile and spoke in a tone clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Good afternoon, sir. I am sorry for the inconvenience. The office fell completely silent. No computer keyboards. No phones. No whispered conversations. Nothing. Emma looked at her father with wide eyes. Richard stared in disbelief. Because in that single moment, the entire balance of authority inside the building shifted. And everyone finally understood that the most important person in the room had never been the one sitting behind the desk. The silence lasted several seconds after those words were spoken. Not because anyone had been instructed to remain quiet, but because nobody knew what to say. Employees throughout the branch looked at Daniel differently now. The uncertainty was gone. In its place was understanding. Not complete understanding. But enough to realize they had misjudged him from the moment he walked through the door. Emma looked up at her father. Why did she call you sir? Daniel smiled. She was being polite. Emma narrowed her eyes. That is not the whole answer. The executive laughed softly. She is very observant. I know, Daniel replied. For the first time all day, the atmosphere felt lighter. The transfer documents were brought into the office almost immediately. The delays that had consumed hours suddenly disappeared. Approvals arrived within minutes. Verifications were completed without discussion. Systems that had seemed complicated all morning now appeared remarkably efficient. Daniel reviewed the paperwork carefully before signing. The executive remained nearby, not because she needed to oversee the process, but because she seemed genuinely pleased to see it finally completed. Richard stood quietly near the back of the room. The confidence that had defined him earlier had been replaced by reflection. Eventually he stepped forward. Mr. Carter. Daniel looked up. Yes? Richard hesitated for a moment. Then he spoke with complete sincerity. I owe you an apology. The office became quiet again. Daniel studied him briefly. For what? Richard glanced down before answering. For making assumptions. Daniel nodded slowly. That happens. It should not. Daniel considered the response. Then he smiled. Probably not. The simple answer seemed to surprise Richard more than anger ever could have. No lecture. No humiliation. No attempt to embarrass him in front of his employees. Just a calm acknowledgement of a mistake. The executive watched the exchange with quiet approval. Emma looked between the adults. My teacher says everybody makes mistakes. Richard laughed softly. Your teacher sounds wise. Emma nodded. She is. The final authorization arrived a few moments later. The transfer was complete. $8 million moved exactly where it was supposed to go. After hours of confusion, concern, and speculation, the transaction itself took only seconds. Daniel gathered his documents and stood. The executive extended her hand once more. Please let us know if you ever need anything. Daniel shook it politely. I appreciate that. It was good seeing you again. You too. Emma slipped her workbook into her backpack. Then she looked at the executive. Thank you for helping. The woman smiled warmly. You are very welcome. Together, Daniel and Emma walked through the lobby toward the exit. Employees who had barely noticed them earlier now stepped aside respectfully. Yet Daniel moved exactly as he had when he arrived. Same jacket. Same calm expression. Same unhurried pace. Outside, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the city streets. Emma climbed into the pickup truck and buckled her seatbelt. As Daniel started the engine, she finally asked the question she had been holding all day. Are you rich? Daniel laughed quietly. That depends how you measure it. Emma thought about that. How do you measure it? Daniel looked at his daughter sitting beside him. Then he smiled. By knowing exactly what matters most. Emma considered the answer for several seconds. Then she smiled too. The old pickup rolled out of the parking garage and disappeared into the afternoon traffic. Behind them, the branch would remember the transfer. The executives would remember the account. The employees would remember the lesson. But Daniel carried away something far more valuable than money, status, or recognition. He carried the quiet certainty that real worth never needed to announce itself. It only needed time for the truth to arrive.